A black beggar woman was sitting on the street when a wealthy man invited her to his ex-wife's wedding. As she spoke at the event, the Johannesburg afternoon sun cast long shadows over the busy streets of Sandton. Kwame Dlamini wandered aimlessly, his Armani suit contrasting sharply with the somber expression on his face. His steps took him away from the glittering skyscrapers and luxury boutiques toward a less glamorous part of the city. The invitation to his ex-fiancée Zola's wedding weighed heavily in his pocket, a constant reminder of his pain and resentment. Kwame could feel the bitterness growing in his chest, mixed with a fierce determination to prove he had moved on, even if it was only a facade. As he walked, his eyes caught an unusual sight: a woman, clearly homeless, sitting on a park bench reading a battered book. What drew Kwame's attention wasn't her disheveled appearance, but the dignity with which she carried herself and the glint of intelligence in her eyes. Impulsively, Kwame approached her. "Excuse me," he said, his voice hesitant. The woman raised her eyes, revealing a face that, despite the marks of time and hardship, still retained an ethereal beauty. "Yes," she replied, her voice surprisingly melodious. "My name is Kwame Dlamini," he introduced himself, feeling strangely nervous. "I have a proposition for you." The woman arched an eyebrow, a mixture of curiosity and caution in her gaze. "I'm Namsa," she said simply. "What kind of proposition?" Kwame hesitated, suddenly aware of the absurdity of his idea, but the image of Zola, radiant in her wedding dress next to another man, spurred him on. "I'd like to hire you to be my date for an event," he explained, the words rushing out. "A wedding, to be specific." "My ex-fiancée's wedding." Namsa slowly closed the book, her eyes never leaving Kwame's face. "And why would you want to take a homeless woman as a date to your ex-fiancée's wedding?" she asked, her voice laced with skepticism. Kwame felt warmth creep up his neck. "To make an impression," he admitted, "to show that I've moved on." A wry smile played on Namsa's lips. "Ah, revenge, the noblest motive of all," she commented sarcastically. Kwame felt embarrassed but continued. "I'll pay you well enough to start a new life if you want." Namsa studied him for a long moment, her piercing eyes seeming to read his soul. "And what exactly would this new life involve?" she asked. "A complete makeover," Kwame explained, gaining confidence as he spoke. "New clothes, a new look, etiquette lessons if necessary. You'd be transformed into a sophisticated socialite for a few weeks." Namsa let out a bitter laugh. "Do you think you can turn me into a modern-day Cinderella with a snap of your fingers?" "No," Kwame replied, surprising himself with his sincerity. "I think you already have something special, something that can't be bought or taught. I just want to give you the opportunity to show it." A silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant sounds of traffic and the rustling of leaves in the park's trees. Namsa seemed to be fighting an internal battle, her eyes revealing a whirlwind of emotions. Finally, she spoke. "Why me? Of all the people in this city, why choose a homeless person?" Kwame hesitated, searching for the right words. "Because you have dignity," he finally said. "You're sitting here reading." "What is this?" Shakespeare. Namsa nodded, a slight blush tinting her cheeks. "You have a strength that I admire," Kwame continued, "and frankly, because you have nothing to lose and everything to gain." Namsa considered his words for a moment. "And if I say no?" she asked. "Then I'll wish you luck and be on my way," Kwame replied honestly. "But I hope you say yes." Namsa closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering her courage. When she opened them again, there was a fierce determination in her gaze. "All right, Mr. Dlamini. I accept your proposal." Kwame felt a mixture of relief and excitement. "Good," he said, holding out his hand. "Shall we get started?" Namsa hesitated for a moment before taking his hand. Her touch was surprisingly warm and firm. "Before we go," she said, "there's something you need to know. I wasn't always homeless. I had a life, a career, and I lost it all." Kwame felt a knot forming in his throat. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "Don't be," Namsa replied, a glint of defiance in her eyes. "Just understand that I'm not a charity project or a pawn in your revenge game. I'm a person with a history and dignity of my own." Kwame nodded, feeling a growing respect for this enigmatic woman. "I understand," he said, "and I promise to respect that." As they left the park together, Kwame couldn't help feeling that he was embarking on something much bigger than simple revenge, something that could change his life forever. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the city. The shadows lengthened, but for the first time in months, Kwame felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest. He looked at Namsa, who was walking with her head held high, her Shakespeare book clutched tightly against her chest. So he said, breaking the silence, "Where do we start?" Namsa looked at him, an enigmatic smile playing on her lips. "At the beginning, Mr. Dlamini, always at the beginning." And so, under the velvety Johannesburg sky, an unlikely partnership was born, ready to challenge convention and shake the foundations of high society. The game had begun, and neither of them could have foreseen the twists and turns that awaited them. The morning sun filtered through the silk curtains of Kwame's penthouse apartment, casting a golden glow over Namsa, who was sleeping soundly in one of the guest bedrooms. Her eyes opened slowly, disoriented by the luxurious softness of the Egyptian sheets and the almost palpable silence that surrounded her. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. The cream-colored walls, the elegant furniture, and the breathtaking view of Johannesburg seemed to belong to another world, a world from which she had been exiled long ago. A soft knock on the door brought her back to reality. Namsa Kwame's voice sounded from the other side. "Are you awake? We've got a busy day ahead of us." Namsa sat up, running her fingers through her tangled hair. "I'm awake," she replied, her voice still hoarse from sleep. When she opened the door, Kwame was there, impeccably dressed in a navy blue suit. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of her, as if he were seeing her for the first time. "Good morning," he said, a slight blush tinging his cheeks. "Breakfast is ready. Then we'll start your transformation." Namsa nodded, following him into the kitchen. The aroma of fresh coffee and freshly baked croissants filled her senses, making her stomach rumble audibly. "Please help yourself." Kwame gestured to the bountiful table. "We need you well fed for the day ahead." As they ate, Kwame explained the itinerary: a visit to the beauty salon followed by a shopping spree in the city's most exclusive boutiques. Namsa listened in silence, a mixture of anxiety and excitement bubbling in her chest. "Kwame," she finally said, placing her coffee cup on the table, "why are you doing this, really?" Kwame paused, his eyes meeting hers. "Honestly, at first it was about revenge," he admitted, "but now I'm not so sure. Maybe it's a chance to do something good, to help someone." Namsa studied him for a moment, searching for signs of insincerity but finding only vulnerability. "You know this isn't going to fill the void Zola left, don't you?" Kwame lowered his gaze, a sad smile playing on his lips. "Maybe it won't, but maybe it can be the start of something new for both of us." The day passed in a whirlwind of activity. At the beauty salon, Namsa watched in fascination as her reflection in the mirror was transformed. Her hair, once dull and lifeless, took on a silky shine and an elegant cut that perfectly framed her face. Her nails, previously broken and battered, were carefully manicured. In the haute couture boutique, Namsa found herself surrounded by luxurious fabrics and sophisticated designs. Each dress she tried on seemed to reveal a new facet of her personality, a version of herself she had forgotten existed. "You look beautiful," Kwame murmured, his eyes shining with admiration as she emerged from the fitting room wearing an emerald green evening gown. Namsa felt a blush creep up her neck. "Thank you," she said softly, surprising herself with the emotion in her own voice. As the day progressed, Kwame began to notice something intriguing about Namsa. Not only was she adapting quickly to her new appearance, but she also displayed a surprising knowledge of fashion, art, and social etiquette. "You seem quite familiar with all of this," he commented as they ate lunch in an exclusive restaurant. Namsa froze for a moment, her fork suspended in the air. "I wasn't always homeless, Kwame," she finally said, her voice laden with a sadness he hadn't noticed before. "There was a time when I belonged to this world." Kwame leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "What happened?" Namsa put down her fork, her eyes drifting into a distant memory. "I was a successful executive. I had everything: money, status, a bright future ahead of me. But then," she paused, swallowing hard, "there was a scandal. A corporate conspiracy. I was used as a scapegoat. I lost everything: my career, my reputation, my life." Kwame felt a knot forming in his throat. I'm sorry, he said softly, reaching out to touch her hand. Namsa withdrew her hand gently, a sad smile on her lips. Don't be. It was a long time ago. I've learned a lot since then about what really matters in life. The rest of the day passed in a blur of etiquette lessons and rehearsals for the big event. Kwame watched, fascinated, as Namsa absorbed each new piece of information with an ease that bordered on the supernatural. In the evening, back at the apartment, Kwame found Namsa on the balcony, gazing out at the city lights. She looked stunning in her new look, but there was a melancholy in her eyes that touched him deeply. Are you all right? He asked, joining her. Namsa turned to him, an enigmatic smile on her lips. I'm remembering who I used to be, she said softly, and wondering who I am now. Kwame felt a wave of emotion wash over him. You're extraordinary, he said, surprised at the sincerity in his own voice. No matter what you wear or what you look like. Namsa studied him for a long moment, her eyes shining with something he couldn't decipher. Thank you, Kwame, she finally said, for giving me this chance not just to transform myself on the outside, but to rediscover who I am on the inside. As they stood there, side by side, looking out over the city that never sleeps, Kwame felt something change inside him. What had started out as a plan for revenge was turning into something deeper, something more meaningful. And for the first time in a long time, he felt truly alive. Night fell over Johannesburg, enveloping the city in a blanket of stars and twinkling lights. On Kwame's rooftop, two lonely souls found a moment of connection, a silent promise of something more to come. Namsa's transformation was just beginning, and with it, Kwame's transformation too. The ballroom of the Maslow Hotel sparkled under the light of hundreds of chandeliers, reflecting the glitter of the jewels and the glamour of the evening gowns. It was the night of the Dlamini Foundation's annual charity ball, an event that brought together the cream of Johannesburg society. The air was thick with expensive perfumes and even more valuable expectations. Kwame adjusted his bow tie, feeling a mixture of anxiety and excitement. Next to him, Namsa took a deep breath, her fingers lightly squeezing the diamond clutch that matched her sapphire blue silk dress. Are you ready? Kwame asked, offering his arm. Namsa nodded, a confident smile on her crimson lips. Born ready, she replied, intertwining her arm with his. The double doors opened, and all eyes turned to the newly arrived couple. Kwame felt a surge of pride as he saw the expressions of surprise and admiration on the faces around them. Namsa, for her part, maintained a graceful posture, as if she had been born for this moment. Kwame, darling, a shrill voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. Vivian Dlamini, Kwame's mother, approached, her sharp eyes appraising Namsa from head to toe. Who's your lovely date? Mom, this is Namsa, Kwame introduced, noticing Namsa's slight grip on his arm. Namsa, my mother, Vivian Dlamini, it's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Dlamini, Namsa said, her voice soft and melodious. Your son has been a wonderful host. Vivian arched a perfectly drawn eyebrow. I imagined, so she murmured, her tone making it clear that she had her suspicions about the nature of their relationship. Kwame has always had peculiar taste in company. Before Kwame could reply, a familiar figure emerged from the crowd. Zola, his ex-fiancée, looked stunning in a red dress that hugged her curves. Next to her, her fiancé, Saifo, looked uncomfortable in his tuxedo. Kwame Zola greeted, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of Namsa. What a pleasant surprise, Zola, Kwame replied, feeling a familiar knot forming in his stomach. You look as beautiful as ever. Allow me to introduce Namsa. Zola held out her hand, a forced smile on her lips. Charmed, she said, her voice betraying a hint of jealousy. I don't think we've met before. Are you new in town? Namsa smiled, accepting the handshake with grace. Actually, I'm an old acquaintance from Johannesburg, she replied softly. I've just been absent for a while. Zola frowned, clearly puzzled. Oh. And what circle did you used to move in? The same as you? I imagine, Namsa replied with a twinkle in her eye. Although I've discovered that there's a lot more to life than parties and gossip. A tense silence fell over the group. Kwame felt a mixture of pride and apprehension at seeing Namsa confront Zola so elegantly. Well, Zola finally said, her voice tight, I hope you enjoy the party. If you'll excuse us. As Zola walked away, dragging a confused Saifo with her. Kwame couldn't help but notice the look of admiration his ex-fiancé cast at Namsa. As the evening progressed, Namsa continued to surprise Kwame. She navigated the conversations with ease, discussing art with a renowned curator, debating politics with a senator, and even exchanging jokes in Zulu with a foreign diplomat. "You seem quite familiar with all of this," Kwame commented during a quiet moment, genuinely impressed. Namsa smiled, a hint of sadness in her eyes. "A lifetime of experiences, Kwame. Some good, some not so good, but all valuable." As they danced a waltz, Kwame found himself more and more intrigued by the enigmatic woman in his arms. She was so much more than just an escort to make Zola jealous. Namsa was a mystery he longed to unravel. "You're doing incredibly well," he murmured, leading her through the steps of the dance. "Thank you," she replied, her eyes shining. "But remember, Kwame, this is just a role I'm playing. Don't fall for the illusion." Her words struck him with unexpected force. Kwame realized, with a mixture of surprise and concern, that he was already taking that risk. Across the hall, Zola watched the couple with a mixture of jealousy and fascination. She turned to Saifo, who was engaged in a conversation about golf. "Who is she really?" Zola asked, more to herself than to her fiancé. "And why does Kwame seem so different with her?" Saifo followed Zola's gaze, frowning. "Maybe he's finally moved on," he suggested, a touch of irritation in his voice. Just as you should. Zola ignored the comment, her eyes fixed on Kwame and Namsa. There was something about the way they moved together, as if they shared a secret that no one else knew. As the evening wore on, the whispers about Kwame Dlamini's mysterious companion grew louder. Who was she? Where had she come from? And how had she won the heart of Johannesburg's most eligible bachelor? Namsa, for her part, felt the weight of the stares and the expectations. Every smile, every graceful gesture was a reminder of who she used to be and everything she had lost. But there was also a growing sense of empowerment, a rediscovery of her own strength. When the party finally came to an end, Kwame and Namsa left the Maslow Hotel under a shower of camera flashes and excited whispers. In the comfort of the limousine, Namsa finally relaxed, letting out a long, shaky sigh. "You were amazing," Kwame said softly, taking her hand. "Thank you for tonight." Namsa looked up at him, her eyes shining with unspoken emotion. "Thank you for giving me this opportunity, Kwame. For a moment I felt alive again." The silence that followed was full of unspoken possibilities. As the limousine glided through the streets of Johannesburg, Kwame found himself questioning his original motives. What had started as a simple revenge plot was turning into something much deeper and more meaningful. Back at the apartment, Namsa stood on the balcony, looking out at the city lights. Kwame joined her, feeling a connection that went beyond their initial agreement. "What happens now?" Namsa asked softly, her voice almost lost in the night wind. Kwame looked at her, seeing not just the stunning woman from the party, but the complex and fascinating person he was beginning to know. "Now," he replied, "we move on. There are more events, more opportunities for you to shine. And maybe we'll discover more about ourselves in the process." Namsa nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "Sounds like a dangerous plan, Mr. Dlamini." "The best laid plans usually are," Kwame replied with a smile. As the night deepened, Kwame and Namsa stood on the balcony, two strangers brought together by unusual circumstances, on the brink of a journey that promised to transform them both in ways they couldn't yet foresee. The morning sun seeped through the curtains of Kwame's apartment, finding Namsa sitting on the balcony with a steaming cup of coffee between her hands. Her eyes, still sleepy, scanned the headlines of the newspaper spread out on the glass table. Suddenly, she froze, her face paling as her fingers traced the lines of the article in disbelief. "It can't be," she muttered, her fingers trembling. That's how Kwame found her minutes later. "Namsa, is everything all right?" She looked up, a mixture of shock and pain in her eyes. "Kwame," she said, her voice shaking. "We need to talk." He sat down next to her, concern evident on his face. "What happened?" Namsa pushed the newspaper toward him. "Read this." The article spoke of an ongoing investigation into a corporate scandal from years ago. One name stood out: Dlamini Enterprises. "I don't understand," Kwame said, frowning. "What does this have to do with you?" Namsa took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, they were filled with fierce determination. "Remember when I told you I lost everything because of a corporate scandal? This was it. And your company, Kwame, was at the center of it all." The shock hit Kwame like a punch to the gut. "What? But how?" "I was the CFO of Global Tech at the time," Namsa explained, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "I discovered irregularities in the accounts, a conspiracy involving several companies. When I tried to expose the truth, I was silenced. I lost my job, my reputation, my life." Kwame shook his head in disbelief. "No, there must be some mistake. My father would never." "Your father may not have known," Namsa interrupted gently, "but someone at Dlamini Enterprises was involved, and I paid the price." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken revelations and turbulent emotions. Kwame stood up abruptly, pacing back and forth on the balcony. "Why didn't you tell me before?" he finally asked, his voice tense. "At first, I didn't know who you were," Namsa said sadly. "And then, things got complicated." Kwame stopped, staring at her. "How complicated?" "Like the fact that I was starting to care about you," Namsa admitted softly. "In a way I didn't expect." Kwame's heart leapt, but confusion and guilt kept him at bay. "I need to find out the truth," he said finally. "If my family had any involvement in this, I need to know." Namsa nodded, standing up. "I understand. But Kwame, be prepared. The truth isn't always easy to accept." In the hours that followed, Kwame plunged into a frantic investigation. Calls were made, old files unearthed, favors called in. Namsa watched from a distance, her heart heavy with the guilt of bringing this storm into Kwame's life. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, Kwame's expression became more and more somber. Finally, he hung up the phone and turned to Namsa, his face a mask of heartbreak and betrayal. "You were right," he said, his voice hoarse. "My father, he knew. Maybe he wasn't the architect, but he allowed it to happen. He turned a blind eye to the corruption for the sake of profits." Namsa approached him hesitantly. "Kwame, I'm sorry. I never wanted to know," he interrupted, holding up a hand. "Don't apologize. You didn't do anything wrong. I'm the one who owes you an apology for everything you've been through, for the part my family played in it." She touched his arm gently. "You're not responsible for your father's mistakes, Kwame." "Maybe not," he agreed, "but I am responsible for correcting them at that moment." Something changed between them. What had begun as an agreement of convenience, a sham for society, had turned into something deeper, something real. "What are you going to do now?" Namsa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kwame looked at her, his eyes shining with determination and vulnerability. "I'm going to expose the truth no matter what the cost. But Namsa, I can't ask you to stand by me in this battle. You've suffered enough because of my family." Namsa stepped forward, taking Kwame's hands in hers. "You don't have to ask," she said firmly. "I choose to stay not just for justice, but for you. For what we've built together." The look they exchanged was charged with emotion, years of pain and hope intertwining in a moment of mutual understanding. In the weeks that followed, Kwame and Namsa worked tirelessly to gather evidence and build a solid case against those responsible for the scandal. Each new discovery brought them closer together, forging a bond that went beyond their initial arrangement. One evening, exhausted after hours of work, they found themselves on the balcony, looking out at the city lights. Kwame turned to Namsa, his eyes shining with an emotion he could no longer contain. "Namsa," he began, his voice trembling. "I know we started this as a game, a lie. But what I feel for you now, it's the truest thing I've ever experienced." Namsa felt her heart race. "Kwame, But before she could finish, Kwame's phone rang, interrupting the moment. It was his lawyer, with urgent news about the case. While Kwame took the call, Namsa watched his profile against the Johannesburg night sky. She knew they were on the verge of something monumental, not just in terms of justice, but in their personal lives. The road ahead would be difficult, full of obstacles and broken hearts. But there, on that balcony, with the city at her feet and the truth finally coming to light, Namsa felt a spark of hope. A hope not just for justice, but for a fresh start, a chance to rebuild her life alongside someone who saw her for who she really was. When Kwame hung up the phone and turned to her, their eyes met. No words were necessary. They knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together. The night deepened around them, the city pulsing with life and possibilities. And there, in the heart of Johannesburg, two wounded souls found comfort in each other, ready to face the storms to come, side by side. Zola's reflection in the mirror looked strange, almost unrecognizable. Her eyes, usually bright and confident, were clouded with doubt and uncertainty. She adjusted her wedding dress for the umpteenth time, searching for non-existent imperfections. "You look beautiful," dear, her mother said, entering the room with a forced smile. Saifa will be delighted, Zola nodded mechanically, but her heart wasn't in it. Her thoughts kept wandering back to the night of the charity ball, to the look she had seen in Kwamem's eyes when he danced with Nomsa. It was a look she knew well, the same one he used to give her. Mom, Zola began hesitantly. "Have you ever wondered if you're doing the right thing, even when everything looks perfect on the outside?" Zola's mother froze for a moment, her smile faltering. "Honey, it's just pre-wedding jitters. It's perfectly normal," but Zola knew it was more than that. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind of mixed emotions. Every time she saw Kwame and Nomsa together at social events, in gossip columns, even in her restless dreams, she felt a pang of jealousy, regret. "I need some air," Zola muttered, hurrying out of the room. She wandered through the mansion's gardens, her wedding dress dragging on the grass, damp with morning dew. The wedding was scheduled for the next day, and all of Johannesburg was eagerly awaiting the social event of the year. Everyone, that is, except the bride. Zola found herself standing in front of the ancient oak tree, where Kwame had proposed to her almost 2 years ago. Memories flooded her mind, his nervousness, the sparkle of the ring, the feeling that the whole world was opening up before them. What's changed, she wondered aloud. Perhaps the question is, what hasn't changed? A familiar voice replied. Zola turned around in surprise to find Nomsa standing a few meters away. She looked simple but elegant in a light blue dress that highlighted her eyes. "Nomsa," Zola said, her voice a mixture of surprise and caution. "What are you doing here?" Nomsa stepped forward, her face calm but determined. "I came to talk to you, Zola. About Kwame. About you. About everything." Zola felt her heart racing. "There's nothing to talk about. I'm getting married tomorrow." "Are you?" Nomsa asked softly. "Because you don't look like a happy bride." The words hit Zola like a slap. She felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she bravely held them back. "You don't know anything about me." "I know more than you realize," Nomsa replied, her voice gentle but firm. "I know that you still love Kwame. And I know that he still cares about you." Zola shook her head, confused. "Then why? Why are you here? Why aren't you fighting for him?" Nomsa smiled sadly. "Because it's not about me, Zola. It's about the two of you facing the truth you've been avoiding for so long." The two women stared at each other for a long moment, the air between them charged with unspoken emotions. Finally, Zola collapsed onto a nearby bench, the tears finally escaping. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I love Saifo, I really do. But Kwame, he'll always be my first love." Nomsa sat down next to her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "First love is powerful, Zola, but it's not always the right love." Zola looked up, surprised by the compassion in Nomsa's voice. "How can you be so understanding? I thought you hated me." Nomsa shook her head, a sad smile on her lips. "Hate only breeds more hate, Zola, and we've all suffered enough." At that moment, Zola saw Nomsa not as a rival, but as someone who understood her pain, who had been through her own trials. "What happened to you?" Nomsa, Zola asked softly. "How did you end up?" "Well, you know." Nomsa took a deep breath, her eyes drifting into distant memories. "It's a long story, Zola. A story of betrayal, loss, and eventually redemption. But we're not here to talk about me. We're here for you." Zola nodded, feeling an unexpected connection with the woman who was supposed to be her enemy. "What should I do?" "Be honest with yourself," Nomsa replied. "And with Saifo. He deserves to know the truth, whatever it is." Nomsa's words echoed in Zola's mind, mingling with her own doubts and fears. She stood up abruptly, a new determination in her eyes. "I need to talk to Kwame," she said, "before it's too late." Nomsa nodded, a mixture of sadness and understanding in her gaze. Do what you need to do, Zola. But remember, sometimes letting go is the greatest act of love. Zola looked at Namsa one last time, gratitude in her eyes. Thank you, she whispered, before turning and running back to the mansion. Namsa stood there, watching Zola disappear into the distance. Her heart was heavy, but she knew she had done the right thing. Love, she had learned, was not about possession but about freedom. Meanwhile, in his Johannesburg apartment, Kwame was immersed in papers and documents, still working tirelessly to unravel the scandal that had ruined Namsa's life. He barely noticed when the door opened and Zola walked in, still in her wedding dress. Kwame, she called softly. He looked up, shocked to see her there. Zola? What's going on? Zola stepped forward, tears shining in her eyes. We need to talk, Kwame. About us. About the past. About the future. Kwame stood up slowly, his heart pounding. He knew this moment would change everything forever. Zola, he began, his voice trembling. But before he could continue, the phone rang, interrupting the moment. It was his lawyer, with urgent news about the case. Kwame looked at Zola, torn between the past and the present, between the love he once felt and the mission that now consumed him. Zola saw the hesitation in his eyes and understood. With a sad smile, she nodded. Pick up, she said softly. Some things are bigger than both of us. As Kwame answered the call, Zola watched the man she had once thought she knew so well. She saw the passion in his eyes, the determination in his posture, and she knew, in that moment, that the Kwame she had loved no longer existed. He had become someone new, someone with a greater purpose. With a heavy heart, but strangely at peace, Zola turned to leave. She knew now what she needed to do. As night fell over Johannesburg, 3 tormented souls faced their truths. Zola, about to make the hardest choice of her life, Kwame, torn between the past and the future, and Namsa, watching from afar, her heart broken but her conscience clear. Fate had intertwined their lives in unexpected ways. And now, on the eve of a wedding that might never happen, the future was full of possibilities and uncertainties. The ballroom of the Santon Sun Hotel flickered under the soft glow of hundreds of candles, the murmur of conversation mingling with the soft notes of a string quartet. It was the night of the rehearsal dinner for Zola's wedding. An event that should have been filled with joy and anticipation. However, the air was charged with unspoken tension and secrets waiting to be revealed. Kwame nervously adjusted his bow tie, his eyes scanning the room for Namsa. She was radiant in an emerald green dress, chatting animatedly with a group of guests. For a moment, their gazes met, and Kwame felt his heart leap. How things had changed in such a short time. Across the hall, Zola watched the scene with a mixture of sadness and resignation. Her white cocktail dress seemed to weigh a ton, a constant reminder of the future she was no longer sure she wanted. Are you all right, darling? Saifo asked, placing a gentle hand on her back. Zola forced a smile. Yes, just a bit nervous, but before Saifo could reply, a buzz spread through the hall. Theodore Dlamini, Kwame's father, had arrived, and the expression on his face was one of pure fury. Kwame thundered, crossing the hall with determined strides. What the hell do you think you're doing? Silence fell over the crowd, all eyes on the imminent confrontation between father and son. Kwame straightened up, his expression a mixture of determination and sadness. Doing the right thing, Dad. Something we should have done a long time ago. Theodore grabbed Kwame's arm, pulling him close. Do you have any idea what's at stake? What this will do to our family, to the company? And do you have any idea how many lives have been destroyed by our greed? Kwame retorted, his voice low but firm. Namsa watched the scene unfold, her heart pounding. She knew this was a crucial moment, not just for Kwame, but for everyone involved in the scandal that had ruined her life. Zola, sensing the gravity of the situation, hesitantly approached. What's going on? She asked, looking from Kwame to Theodore. It was Namsa who answered, her voice calm but charged with emotion. The truth, Zola. The truth that's been hidden for so long. And then, in front of the astonished guests, Namsa began to tell her story, the story of a brilliant young executive whose career and life had been destroyed by a corporate scandal orchestrated by the most powerful. A story of betrayal, greed, and lives ruined in the name of profit. As Namsa spoke, Theodore's face paled. Zola put her hands to her mouth in horror. Saipho, who had been watching in silence until then, stepped forward. "Is it true?" he asked, looking directly at Theodore. Did Dlamini Enterprises really do this? Theodore opened his mouth to reply, but Kwame interrupted him. "Yes, it's true. And I have the proof." A shocked murmur ran through the room. Friends, family, and business colleagues looked at each other in disbelief. "You can't do this," Kwame, Theodore hissed. "You'll destroy everything we've built." "No, Dad," Kwame replied, his voice steady. "I'm saving what's left of our integrity." At that moment, Zola stepped forward, her eyes shining with a mixture of admiration and sadness. "Kwame," she said softly, "I understand now. I understand why you changed. Why we couldn't be together anymore." Kwame looked at her, a wave of gratitude and affection washing over him. Zola, but before he could continue, Theodore, in a final act of desperation, grabbed a glass of champagne and hurled it in Namsa's direction. You've ruined everything." Time seemed to slow down. Kwame moved instinctively to shield Namsa, but it was Zola who arrived first, placing herself between Namsa and the flying liquid. The champagne splashed across Zola's white dress, staining it irreparably. A stunned silence fell over the room. Enough, Saipho's voice boomed, startling everyone. "Mr. Dlamini, I think you'd better leave. Now." Security guards appeared almost instantly, escorting a furious Theodore out of the hall. In the chaos that followed, Kwame found himself at the center of a maelstrom of emotions. He looked at Zola, who smiled sadly as Saipho wrapped her in a protective embrace. He looked at Namsa, whose eyes were filled with a mixture of gratitude and love. "Kwame," Namsa said softly, touching his arm. "You have a choice to make." And at that moment, in front of everyone he knew and loved, Kwame Dlamini made his choice. He turned to Zola and Saipho, his heart heavy but at peace. "Zola," he began, "you will always be an important part of my life." Zola nodded, understanding. "I know, Kwame. Your heart belongs to someone else now." Kwame then turned to Namsa, taking her hands in his. "Namsa, you've shown me what really matters in life. Courage, integrity, true love. I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of your love." Tears glistened in Namsa's eyes as she smiled. "I love you too, Kwame. With all your faults and virtues." The hall, which moments before had been in chaos, was now silent. All eyes were fixed on the couple. It was Zola who broke the silence, her voice strained but sincere. "Be happy, you two," she said, a genuine smile lighting up her face. "You deserve it." Saipho nodded in agreement, pulling Zola closer. "And as for us," he whispered in her ear, "how about we make a fresh start? No pressure, no expectations. Just the two of us." Zola looked at him, seeing him truly for the first time in months. "I'd love that," she replied softly. As the evening progressed, the mood in the room shifted. What had begun as a rehearsal dinner for a wedding turned into a celebration of truth, courage, and new beginnings. Kwame and Namsa danced slowly in the center of the ballroom, lost in each other's eyes. Zola and Saipho talked intimately in a corner, rediscovering the love that had brought them together in the first place. And so, on a night that should have been the prelude to a wedding, new stories of love, redemption, and hope were born. The scandal that had destroyed so many lives would now be exposed, and with it, the chance for healing and justice. As soft music filled the air, Kwame held Namsa close, feeling as if he had finally found his place in the world. "Thank you," he whispered in her ear. "For what?" Namsa asked, looking at him curiously. "For showing me the way back to myself," Kwame replied, his eyes shining with love and gratitude. Namsa smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "We're just getting started, Kwame," she murmured. "We have a long journey ahead of us." And so, under the soft lights of the ballroom, two souls who had been broken by the world found healing and purpose in each other. The future was uncertain, full of challenges and obstacles, but together, they were ready to face it. The night that should have been the end of one story became the beginning of another one much more beautiful and true. And while Johannesburg sparkled outside, inside the Santon sun, love, in all its complex and wonderful forms, triumphed. The sun was rising over Johannesburg, its golden rays sliding through the windows of Kwame's apartment. Namsa sat on the balcony, a steaming cup of coffee between her hands, her eyes lost in thought. The last few weeks had been a roller coaster of emotions, and now, in the quiet of the morning, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. Kwame appeared at the balcony door, his face marked by tiredness but his eyes shining with determination. "Good morning," he said softly, joining her. Namsa smiled, handing him a cup of coffee. "Good morning." "Ready for today?" Kwame nodded, taking a sip. "As ready as I can be. To stand up to my own father and expose decades of corporate corruption." Silence fell between them, heavy with the weight of what was to come. Finally, Namsa spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Kwame, there's something you need to know. Something I found out last night." Kwame turned to her, concern evident on his face. "What is it?" Namsa took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "It wasn't just your father involved in the scandal. It was a much bigger conspiracy, involving some of the most powerful executives in the country. And," she hesitated, her eyes filling with tears, "my downfall was orchestrated by someone very close to me. Someone I trusted completely." Kwame felt his heart tighten. "Who?" "My mentor, Robert Sabeza," Namsa replied, her voice trembling. "The man who trained me, who made me believe I could change the corporate world for the better. He was at the center of it all." The revelation hit Kwame like a punch in the gut. He knew Robert Sabeza, a titan of industry, respected and admired by all. The idea that he could be behind something so nefarious was almost inconceivable. "Namsa, I'm so sorry," Kwame said, pulling her into a tight embrace. "But how did you find out?" "I spent all night going through the files we collected. There's a pattern, Kwame. A pattern only someone at the top could have orchestrated." Kwame nodded slowly, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place in his mind. "That changes everything." "Yes," Namsa agreed. "And that's why we need to be even more careful. Robert has powerful connections, influence at all levels. If we're going to expose the truth, we need to be prepared for the consequences." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of phone calls, emails, and last-minute meetings. Kwame and Namsa worked tirelessly, gathering all the evidence they had collected over the past few weeks. At 2 p.m., they arrived at the imposing Diamini Enterprises building. The lobby was full of reporters and cameras, all eager for the press conference that had been called at the last minute. Kwame felt the weight of the moment on his shoulders. He looked at Namsa, who stood beside him, strong and resolute. "Are you sure about this?" he asked one last time. Namsa nodded, squeezing his hand. "Absolutely. It's time for the truth to come out." They entered the conference room, which was packed with journalists, executives, and, to Kwame's surprise, his father, Theodore Dlamini, sitting in the front row with an expression of barely contained fury. Kwame approached the podium, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked out at the crowd, saw the anxious faces, the cameras ready to capture every word, and then he began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. We are here today to reveal a truth that has been buried for decades. A truth about corruption, greed, and lives destroyed in the name of profit." As Kwame spoke, detailing the evidence they had uncovered, a stunned silence fell over the room. He exposed the financial manipulations, the bribes, the ruined lives. And then came the most crucial revelation, but the most shocking thing of all. Kwame said, his voice trembling slightly, "is that this conspiracy was orchestrated not only by my father, Theodore Dlamini, but also by one of the most respected men in our industry, Robert Sabeza." A shocked murmur ran through the room. Theodore Dlamini stood up abruptly, his face red with anger. "This is absurd. You have no proof." It was then that Namsa stepped forward. "But we do," she said, her voice calm and clear. "And I am living proof of the consequences of your actions." She began to tell her story, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. She recounted how she had been a brilliant young executive, how she had discovered the wrongdoing, and how she had been silenced and destroyed by those she trusted. As Namsa spoke, Kwame watched the audience's reactions. He saw shock, disbelief, and finally, understanding spread across their faces. He saw his father sink into his chair, his arrogance giving way to despair. And then, in the most dramatic moment of the press conference, The doors to the room opened, and Robert Sabeza walked in, escorted by federal agents. His normally impassive face was pale, defeated. "It's true," Sabeza said, his voice hoarse. Everything they said is true. Chaos erupted in the room. Journalists shouted questions, cameras flashed frantically. Theodore Dlamini tried to leave, only to be stopped by more agents entering the room. In the midst of the confusion, Kwame met Namsa's eyes. He saw in them a mixture of relief, sadness, and above all, hope. He held out his hand, and she took it, their fingers intertwining. Hours later, when the dust had begun to settle, Kwame and Namsa found themselves alone on the roof of the Dlamini building. The sun was setting over the city, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "It's over," Namsa said softly, her voice charged with emotion. "It really is over." Kwame pulled her close, wrapping her in a tight embrace. "No, my love," he murmured against her hair. "It's just beginning." They stood there, holding each other as the day gave way to night. Below them, the city pulsed with life, oblivious to the revolution that had just taken place in its corporate world. "What do we do now?" Namsa asked, looking up at Kwame. He smiled, a smile full of promise and possibility. "Now, we rebuild, not just our lives but the company. We're going to turn it into something we can be proud of, something that really makes a difference in the world." Namsa felt her heart fill with love and admiration for this man who had risked everything for the truth. "Together?" she asked, a smile playing on her lips. "Together." Kwame confirmed, leaning down to kiss her softly. As the first stars began to dot Johannesburg's night sky, Kwame and Namsa stood there, entwined, their hearts beating in unison. They had faced the worst the corporate world could offer, and they had emerged stronger, more united. The road ahead would be difficult, full of challenges and obstacles. But now they had each other, and the certainty that, together, they could overcome anything. And so, standing on top of the world they had helped to change, Kwame and Namsa looked to the future with renewed hope. A future that, although uncertain, promised to be bright, full of love, purpose, and the chance to make a difference. Night fell over Johannesburg, enveloping the city in its dark cloak. But for Kwame and Namsa, it was the dawn of a new era, an era and truth, integrity, and true love. And they were ready to face it, side by side, hand in hand, hearts united in one purpose. The end of one story, the beginning of another. The journey continued, more exciting and promising than ever. The moral of this story highlights the transformative power of integrity, love, and redemption. When Kwame, driven initially by revenge, invites a homeless woman, Namsa, to his ex-wife's wedding, he embarks on a journey of emotional growth. Through Namsa's dignity and strength, he learns that true wealth lies not in status or outward appearances, but in the courage to confront the truth, heal from the past, and fight for justice. Both Kwame and Namsa rediscover themselves, moving from brokenness to a place of inner strength, love, and purpose. The story teaches us that, in the face of adversity, humility and empathy pave the way for personal transformation and genuine connections. O Allah, grant us the wisdom to see beyond outward appearances and guide our hearts to pursue truth and justice. Help us to transform our pain into strength and our struggles into pathways for compassion. Teach us humility and success and grace in defeat, and may we always strive to lift others, just as you lift us in our times of need. Amin.